My name is Emily, and at 30, I thought I had life pretty much under control. My husband Ryan has always been my rock, a dependable partner with whom I shared every moment of life. So when he was deployed overseas for what was supposed to be a short-term assignment, I convinced myself that I could handle the emptiness of our small California apartment. After all, we'd built our life on mutual support and trust. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to realize that the silence in our once lively home was far more oppressive than I had ever imagined. The loneliness crept in slowly, insidiously, each quiet night deepening the sense of isolation. I tried to keep busy with work and little routines, yet every corner of the apartment seemed to echo with the absence of his laughter and steady presence. The walls that once held our memories now only reminded me of the gap left by his departure. In those long, restless nights, I found myself wondering if I had underestimated the emotional toll of his absence. A few months into this solitude, a decision was made that I hoped might alleviate the relentless isolation. My younger adopted brother Ethan would be moving in with me for the duration of his internship. At 23, Ethan had always been a quiet presence in my life, a reserved, almost invisible figure in our shared history. We hadn't grown particularly close, largely because our different upbringings had kept us apart. Still, the idea of having family around, even someone I hardly knew well, sparked a glimmer of hope in my otherwise bleak routine. I imagined that his company might fill the void left by Ryan, if only for a little while. In that moment, I embraced a cautious optimism, unaware that this decision would soon unravel layers of suppressed emotions and unforeseen complexities. The apartment, once a symbol of shared dreams with Ryan, was about to witness a new chapter, a chapter that promised to be as unpredictable as it was intensely personal. The emptiness in the apartment grew heavier with each passing day, a tangible reminder of Ryan's absence. In the beginning, I told myself that I was prepared for the separation, that the long hours and quiet evenings were merely temporary gaps in our otherwise intertwined lives. But as the weeks melted into months, the silence transformed into a relentless companion. Each creak of the floorboard, every gust of wind slipping through the window, reminded me of what I was missing. The once comforting hum of daily routines now echoed like a vast, empty void. I found myself wandering from room to room, half expecting to hear Ryan's laugh or the soft murmur of his voice. Yet nothing filled the silence. Instead, I was left with my own thoughts, each one amplifying the loneliness that had settled into my bones. It was a loneliness that wasn't just about the physical absence of a person, it was the loss of a piece of my identity, a missing part of my daily life that I hadn't fully appreciated until it was gone. In the mornings, the bright California light streaming through the curtains felt more like an ironic reminder of the isolation that shadowed every corner of my home. I would sit with a cup of coffee, staring out the window, wondering how the world could go on so normally when my life felt so disrupted. The bustling life of the small town outside seemed to carry on without pause, indifferent to the quiet despair that filled my apartment. At times, I even questioned if I had ever truly understood the depth of my connection to Ryan. The realization hit me hard. I had taken for granted the constant presence of someone who meant the world to me. His absence was not just a logistical gap, it was an emotional chasm that grew wider with each lonely day. In those moments, I felt as if the very walls of our home were closing in, mirroring the internal isolation I struggled to escape. Yet, amid the solitude and introspection, there lingered a subtle, bittersweet hope. I clung to the belief that this period of isolation was temporary, that Ryan's return would somehow mend the fractured pieces of my everyday life. But deep down, I couldn't shake the fear that the loneliness had already left its mark, a mark that might change me in ways I wasn't prepared to confront. When Ethan mentioned he'd be staying with me for the duration of his internship, I felt a hesitant relief. I welcomed him into our home, hopeful that his presence might finally fill some of the deep void I had been struggling with since Ryan's departure. Growing up, Ethan had always been the quiet, reserved kid, almost invisible against the backdrop of my more outgoing nature. We hadn't shared a closeness that comes naturally to siblings, especially since our relationship was forged more by circumstance than by shared experiences. Yet, with his arrival, I was both cautiously optimistic and uncertain of what to expect. The day he moved in, I tried to mask the unease I felt. I had prepared the spare room, tidied up the apartment, and even imagined the possibility of rekindling a familial bond that had long lain dormant. However, as soon as he stepped through the door, I realized that the person before me was not the timid boy I remembered. Ethan had transformed into a striking young man with a newfound confidence that immediately caught me off guard. His posture was assured, his walk measured and deliberate, and his eyes, once filled with quiet reserve, now burned with a piercing intensity that I couldn't ignore. I found myself both impressed and unsettled. There was an unmistakable air of self-assurance about him, a magnetism that pulled my attention in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every detail, from the way he carried himself to the confident inflection in his voice, spoke of a transformation that seemed to have occurred overnight. I tried to remind myself that it was simply my loneliness distorting my perceptions, yet the disquiet lingered. As we unpacked his belongings and settled into an uneasy routine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. Ethan was no longer the quiet, distant presence of my childhood memories. He was someone new, someone whose altered demeanor made me question if our relationship would ever be the same again. The days quickly morphed into a strange blend of routine and disquiet. Almost imperceptibly at first, Ethan's presence began to shift the dynamics of my carefully controlled solitude. I would catch him moving about the apartment in the simplest attire, a t-shirt paired with shorts, as if he were completely unaware of the magnetic pull his casual demeanor exerted over me. Each time our paths crossed, a flutter of disquiet rose within me, an unsettling sensation that I struggled to rationalize. It wasn't merely his presence that unsettled me. It was the way he moved, the way he carried himself with an ease that seemed to mock my internal struggle. There were moments when he emerged from the bathroom with damp hair, droplets catching the light, his expression casual and unfettered. In those instants, my mind betrayed me, my heart would pound, and an inexplicable longing would twist inside me. I knew deep down that such thoughts were wrong, that they defied everything I'd believed about family and duty. Yet, no matter how much I tried to dismiss these feelings as mere figments of a lonely mind, they clung stubbornly to me, growing bolder with each passing day. I found myself caught in a relentless cycle of guilt and desire. Every glance he offered, every slight smile or casual remark, sent ripples through the carefully constructed walls of my restraint. I tried to convince myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on me, a distortion born of too many solitary evenings. But as the days grew longer, the inner turmoil intensified. I began questioning if I was truly in control, or if the solitude had unhinged something deep within me that I could no longer ignore. As I lay awake at night, grappling with the forbidden nature of my thoughts, the apartment felt smaller, the air thicker. The very fabric of our shared living space seemed charged with a tension that I could neither escape nor fully comprehend. It was as if the distance I once felt between us was shrinking, replaced by an intimacy I never intended to seek. Every small gesture, every unguarded moment became a silent confession of emotions I fought so hard to suppress. And with each sunrise, the line between right and wrong blurred a little more, leaving me to wonder how long I could continue to deceive myself about the true nature of my feelings. That night, everything felt different. The air conditioner in Ethan's room had broken unexpectedly, and in a moment of practicality mixed with an unspoken tension, I offered him my room, the only space still blessed with the cool comfort of functioning air conditioning. He hesitated just a moment before accepting, and I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a sensible solution to an inconvenient problem. I had already retreated to bed, seeking the solace of sleep, when I heard the soft creak of the door opening. In the dim light, I glimpsed Ethan's silhouette as he stepped into my room. It was then that I noticed the way his eyes lingered, betraying more than simple curiosity or concern for the broken appliance. He paused at the doorway, his gaze inadvertently tracing the contours of my figure, accentuated by the delicate fabric of my nightgown. In that charged moment, a palpable shift filled the space between us, a tension so thick it could be sliced with a knife. Every minute detail of that encounter struck me with alarming clarity. The casual way in which he had agreed to switch rooms now seemed to carry a weight of unspoken meaning. As I lay there, trying desperately to ignore the stir of conflicting emotions, I couldn't help but feel that something irreversibly altered had taken place. Our shared silence was no longer empty. It was charged with a silent acknowledgement of desires neither of us had dared to voice openly before. In the muted stillness of that night, every glance, every pause, and every subtle gesture resonated like an unspoken confession. It felt as if we were both teetering on the edge of a precipice, where the familiar boundaries of sibling love and duty were dangerously blurring. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, each moment stretching out in anticipation of what might come next, an anticipation that left me both terrified and inexplicably drawn to the forbidden possibility unfolding before us. In the days that followed that unsettling night, our interactions took on a strange new dimension, one that defied the simple routines we'd maintained before. What began as innocent conversations soon deepened into discussions that left us both raw and exposed. It started with small admissions, the kind you might brush off as idle chatter. But as the nights grew longer and the silence of the apartment pressed in around us, our talks began to touch on subjects that were intimate, vulnerable, and dangerously close to the edge of what was acceptable. One evening, as the rain pattered softly against the window, Ethan and I found ourselves seated across from one another at the kitchen table. The conversation meandered from trivial daily details to the confessions of hidden dreams and unmet desires. I watched him speak with an intensity that unsettled me, a look that seemed to search for something deeper than mere companionship. His eyes, once filled only with the reserve of the adopted brother I had known, now shimmered with a kind of longing that was impossible to ignore. Every word felt weighted with unspoken meaning. We talked about our childhoods, our insecurities, and even the small fantasies that had crept into our minds in the quiet hours of the night. There was a raw honesty in our exchange, a vulnerability that made the boundaries between us blur. I found myself revealing things I had never dared to admit aloud, and each revelation seemed to draw us closer, weaving a web of shared secrets and dangerous emotions. As the conversation deepened, I became painfully aware of how our eyes lingered on one another, as if searching for confirmation of feelings too taboo to name. The air between us grew charged with an unspoken promise, a magnetic pull that neither of us could resist. It was as if the room itself had become a silent accomplice, bearing witness to the transformation of our relationship from mere familial obligation to something far more complex and consuming. Each shared laugh, each prolonged silence, carried the weight of a confession waiting to be made, a confession that neither of us could yet bring ourselves to voice, even as the tension between us grew thicker with every passing moment. That night, as the heat of the summer wrapped around us and the weight of unspoken emotions grew too heavy to bear, the fragile line between right and wrong finally blurred. In the darkness of the room, the tension we'd both been fighting for days reached its breaking point. We lay there, side by side, the quiet punctuated only by our uneven breaths and the soft hum of the night. It was not a scene of overt passion, but rather one of a profound, almost painful closeness. A moment when the emotional distance we'd maintained evaporated in the intensity of our shared loneliness. Our eyes met, and in that brief, heart-stopping instant, it was as if everything we had kept hidden for so long was laid bare. We both knew that the boundaries of our relationship, those lines drawn by family ties and years of unspoken rules, were about to be crossed. There was no dramatic declaration, no forceful act, only a slow, mutual surrender to an overwhelming current of suppressed feelings and unaddressed desires. In that quiet moment, our embrace spoke volumes. It was as if the countless silent evenings and the weight of isolation had conspired to bring us together in a way that was as inevitable as it was heartbreaking. The air between us was charged with a mixture of longing and dread. We felt the gravity of our actions long before we even moved. As we edged closer, there was a palpable sense of finality, a recognition that once the line was crossed, nothing could ever return to the way it had been. Afterward, as we slowly pulled away, a heavy silence settled over the room. There was relief, yes, in the release of the tension that had built up over so many lonely days, but it was immediately tempered by a profound, unsettling guilt. The reality of our choices pressed in from all sides, and we knew that the comfort of familiarity had been irrevocably tainted by that one irreversible moment. The consequences of that night loomed large, an unspoken promise that our lives and the very fabric of our shared existence had changed forever. In the days that followed, the apartment became a battleground of silence and remorse. I did everything in my power to avoid Ethan, unable to bear the weight of the secret that now divided us. Every shared glance or accidental encounter was a reminder of that night, a night that had rewritten the boundaries of our relationship and cast a long, dark shadow over every moment. The guilt gnawed at me relentlessly, a constant companion that I couldn't shake. Then, as if fate were determined to test the limits of my shattered resolve, news arrived that Ryan would be returning home unexpectedly. His early homecoming was due to a serious injury he had sustained overseas, a development that sent my heart into a tailspin. I felt the full force of betrayal crashing over me. The thought that while I was lost in a maelstrom of forbidden emotions, my husband had been out there, facing danger and uncertainty, made the situation even more unbearable. When Ryan finally walked through the door, I hardly recognized the man who once filled our home with warmth and vitality. He was different, a shell of the person I had said goodbye to. His eyes, once alight with the promise of our shared future, now held a hollow, pained look that spoke of physical suffering and emotional isolation. I tried desperately to maintain a facade of normalcy, to pretend that nothing had happened, that our lives could resume their familiar cadence. But every time Ethan entered a room, my heart sank deeper into despair, and the truth of my transgression loomed larger. The apartment, once a sanctuary of shared love and dreams, had become a stage for an unfolding tragedy. I felt imprisoned by my own choices, the betrayal an ever-present stain on my soul. Ryan's silent pain and Ethan's hesitant glances only deepened the agony, and I knew that no matter how much I tried to push the guilt aside, the consequences of that fateful night would forever haunt us all. The tension had reached a breaking point, a constant, gnawing pressure that had seeped into every corner of our lives. One evening, as the quiet of the house was shattered by the storm outside, the unthinkable happened. Ryan, whose pain and silence had grown heavier with each passing day, finally confronted the secret that had been festering between us. He had found evidence, small, damning clues that I had desperately tried to keep hidden, thinking the truth could be locked away forever. The discovery was a blow I hadn't seen coming. The confrontation was swift and brutal. In the dim light of our living room, Ryan's eyes blazed with a mix of pain, betrayal, and seething anger. His words came out in a raw, relentless torrent, accusing both me and Ethan of shattering the sanctity of our bond. The air was thick with disbelief and heartache as he demanded answers I was too terrified to give. I could only stand there, paralyzed by guilt and regret, as his words tore through me like a hurricane. There was no explanation that could undo the betrayal, no justification that could mend what had been so recklessly broken. Ethan, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the revelation and the storm of emotions swirling in the room, fled that very night, leaving behind a silence that screamed louder than any words. In the aftermath, the house felt unbearably empty, as if all the warmth and love had been drained away. I was left amidst the ruins of my once stable life, with Ryan's shattered trust echoing in every corner of our home. The man I had relied on for strength now wore a mask of sorrow and disillusionment, a living reminder of how quickly everything could fall apart. As I tried to piece together the fragments of my broken life, Michael's presence, a once comforting memory, felt distant and unreachable. The future lay ahead as an uncertain, barren expanse, and I was forced to confront the painful truth that some actions, once taken, can never be erased.